Let's now create the same fracture object setup with the new RBD material fracture workflow. So let's dive into the geometry node where we had our cube. We moved it upward and then we added the Voronoi fracture. And we added this null object that's a common practice. So instead of doing this, I will bypass the Voronoi fracture and I will create an RBD material fracture node. I will connect my transformed cube to the RBD material fracture and then connect the null to this fracture node. So let's try creating the RBD network now. I'm going to go back to my object setup. So remember the output is here on the RBD fracture and the null object. And let's go to the shelf tool. So look for your rigid body shelf and control click on the RBD glued object, just as we did before. And again, the AutoDOP network has been created. So nothing new here, the exact same setup. And if I go to my object, again, we have the connect adjacent pieces, constraint attributes, and the rest of the setup is exactly the same as we did before. So there's a very important takeaway here. And the thing is that with this setup, you're ignoring the constraints that are being generated here on the material fracture node. So let me show you what I mean. If you notice the three outputs that the RBD material fracture has, the first one is the geometry. The second one is the constraint geometry. So let me add a null node. And let me connect the second output of the RBD material fracture node here just to see the constraint. So although this looks almost identical to this output, here we had already assigned the constraint attributes. For example, the primary strength currently is 10,000. And maybe you switched on the soft constraints when broken option. We'll speak about this later. But basically here on this setup, you're completely ignoring all these constraints. And if we go back to the AutoDOP network, the constraint network is pointing to this constraints output. So let me click on the jump to operator just to see what we're fetching as a constraint. So this is what we're fetching. So let's try to do this again without this null. So I will delete the null altogether. So now I'm back to the material fracture. I can also remove the Voronoi. And we also need to remove the AutoDOP network. So we're back to our standard cube with a fracture. And I will click on the RBD glued object, select my cube, and press enter. So now you will notice something very important. I will press Ctrl B just to take a look at the network with more detail. There has been two constraint networks created. First of all, one constraint network pointing to an object called constraint 1, and a second constraint network pointing to an object called constraints. So I will go back to my cube. Again, I will press Ctrl B, going to my object context, and double click on my box geometry. So notice how the layout here is much different. I will press Ctrl B. And here we have our RBD material fracture. And there's a lot of nodes that have been created. This part you should be familiar with. So we're outputting the low resolution fractured object, which is this third output. We're creating our rest attribute, then setting up the packed primitive and sending to the DOP network. And then we have our constraint adjacent pieces, and this is outputting the constraint number 1. So again, let me go back to my DOP network and take a look at constraint number 1, which is this one. Now, most of the time, if you're using the RBD material fracture workflow, you will completely ignore these constraints. You can altogether turn this off, or you can even disconnect it and ignore it, because your main constraint will come from the RBD material fracture node, which is this one, the node that's called constraints. And again, let's go back to the auto DOP network to take a look at which constraint network we're using. It's this one. So this is very important to remember. It may be a bit confusing, but my guess is that this second network here is being generated just to comply with the old workflow. So let's go back to my box geometry. And for now, we will ignore this branch, and we will be using these constraints that come from the RBD material fracture node. So don't worry for now if this is a bit confusing. We will generate a more practical step-by-step exercise. Just be mindful that if you're using the RBD material fracture node and you're using the shelf tools, you have to make sure that your output is the actual RBD material fracture node and not a null. So in following chapters, we will also create our DOP network and constraints from scratch. And this will be a good practice for you to start memorizing these steps and not necessarily relying on the shelf tools.